Good morning, everybody. I am Mimi Madera, at least for this weekend. I am a graduate of the Grinnell College class of 1967. When I was asked to introduce my friend George Drake, I demurred, assuming that everyone already knew him. There was absolutely no reason to discuss his credentials, his interests, or his accomplishments. So I'm staying away from that. Graduating in 1956, working at Colorado College, being Grinnell's president, entering the Peace Corps, we heard about George and Sue over and over again and tracked all the things that he was doing. And it was a very special treat to see him represent a lot of the things that the alumni were doing as a body. One thing you may not know, he was an amazing mind of facts, names, and places. As I had the privilege of being stopped one fall on the streets of Grinnell as I took a break from driving across country, I was stopped by George, then newly president of Grinnell. He knew my name. He called me Mimi. My eldest daughter was amazed that I knew the president of Grinnell College. I was honored until I realized I was a student of the 60s and a little concerned that he knew my name. Later, when our youngest entered Grinnell, she turned to George for her junior year mentor, senior thesis, and her touchstone as she returned from 9 months in Kenya and complete her studies and graduate. Hence, I believe that we all do, should, or will shortly know George Drake. George related in his lecture at Alumni College that he is to a 2017 graduate as an 1895 graduate is to George. I have the honor to present a Renaissance man, a thoughtful gentleman of all times, and a friend of all of ours. We, the class of 1967, proudly introduce President George Drake to give the 2017 Grinnell College Alumni Lecture.
You put a lot of pressure on me. This better be okay, if not good. So I will do my best. And I am very grateful to the class of 1967 for inviting me to be the alumni lecturer this year. I'm honored by that invitation, and that adds further pressure because it is a real honor to be asked to do this. I love this portrait of Joe in the background, and this gesture, grabbing his collar, usually it meant he was going to say something, because Joe never said a lot. But whatever he said was pretty much what the board decided. And he also had a remarkable sense of timing. Let me tell you a story about, I'm going to do other things, but about Joe that I think encapsulates him. He was, when a student at Grinnell from 1921 to 25, known as Line-A-Day Rosenfield. He had a quip for everything. And he had a humor column in the S&B his senior year. It was a humor column, and its title was Doric, a column of pure beauty. It's worth going into the archives and looking at the S&B for 1924-25 to see there's some pretty funny things in it. Anyway, this is the contentious board meeting in 1968 when they are discussing the administration recommendation for coeducational dormitories. You can imagine, well, I hope you can imagine after I've talked to you a bit this morning, how difficult that was for the board. many people. Well, in the first place, many were graduates of Grinnell and loved the dormitory system and the segregated dorm system. So in personal terms, they did not think this would be a good change, but of course the norms of the society were being challenged. Joe said nothing until it was beginning to really boil. And then Joe said, "Well," he said, "I'm for it if they make it retroactive." And the board did exactly what you just did. They broke up and immediately voted for co-ed dorms. So at another time, and I'll mention this in '72 when we created the pub, again, we were breaching the covenants of the town, had to get the town to change those covenants, as well as the practices of the college to allow formally drinking on campus. But there was at that time, a 19-year-old drinking rule, so all but the first years or freshmen could probably be there. It was Joe and Warren Buffett who moved and seconded that we do that. So Joe, one of his great attributes was he understood what it was like to be a student. He loved his student years, and he really resonated with the students. But now I digress, and I will get into exactly what I'm intending to say. It was either a phone call or an email from Paige Everly, sort of a last-minute thing. Could I come over and meet with the 67 planners for their reunion? About a lunchtime, I think, wasn't it, Mimi? And so I went over. And by the way, mentioning Paige, I just want we are all in this room beneficiaries of her tremendous organizational skills. Planning and carrying out these reunions is one of the most difficult tasks at the college, and she does it beautifully, and so she does a great job. Okay, well, so I went over, and they were talking about this event, having a lecture, and would I be interested, and what might I be interested in doing. At the time, I was immersed in the trustee minutes. I'm doing this biography of Joe, and I have to tell you that last week I went to see the publishers, and I said, I think I can have a manuscript for you by January. So I sort of put the pressure on myself. Now I'm going to get this thing done. I'm not getting any younger, and I better get it done. Anyway, so I was immersed in those trustee minutes, and so I just started talking with the group about that. And saying, you folks were here at the cusp of the student revolution. And those trustee minutes are really, really fascinating to read with respect to that. And it's absolutely true that until you get into the 1960s, the students appear in the minutes only as numbers. Graduating numbers, admissions numbers. And I can tell you that there was a lot of discussion about those admissions numbers. The college was going through extremely difficult times in attracting students. I'm a 56 graduate, born in 1934. I am one of those things called a Depression baby. And for our generation, we were a blessed generation. There were so few of us that opportunities abounded at every level. And if you were warm and ambulatory, you could be a student at Grinnell College. And they were anxious to have us. And there's Emily Fitch sitting back there, and John Fitch would get $25 per student that he could rustle up in the Chicago area. They were sending folks out, bounty hunters for students. I'm glad to say that those of you who entered in 1963 were a little harder to get. Things were turning, the demographics were beginning to turn around, and so the college could begin to be selective. So anyway, that's what I was telling them about, and also just the fact that the trustees were borrowing money at just about every meeting in order to make payroll. I mean, those were really tough times. And then I said, but it's extraordinary what happens in those minutes when the student revolution begins. Suddenly, the students are persons. They're a presence. And they will become the biggest presence in the trustee minutes as you move through the later 60s and into the early 70s. I became a trustee in 1970. I got demoted in '79 into the presidency, but and so I was able to witness some of that as well. And so the students now, dealing with the students becomes front and center in those trustee minutes. And I'm going to get into that in some detail in just a little bit, but I wanted to make some generalizations first. I come at this from a student of the 1950s. The 58, 57 folks are having a reunion, and I'm Sue's 58, so I'm hanging around with those folks. We were Depression babies, and we grew up during World War II. And that is huge. I spent most of my spare time fighting World War II as a kid. I made my own guns. You'd think I would have been the greatest devotee of the gun culture ever. I spent so much time making different kinds of guns. My uncle turned a 50 caliber machine gun with had a tripod for me, so I could. We had a Navy unit. I lived in Crete, Nebraska, Doane College, and they had a Navy unit, and I used to mow them down as they went to dinner every night. And they had a sort of a back campus, and I'd sneak around there, ambushing people and so on. I mean, World War II consumed us. And I can remember my parents talking about well-adjusted children and maladjusted children. Would I be well-adjusted? I was sort of on the borderline most of the time, and actually more toward the mal than the well. That was our mantra. And the war was on. There wasn't a whole lot you could do. I was second grade when the war began. So I'm cognizant as a human being about that. And we were scared. I can remember all those posters of Japanese walking down Pennsylvania Avenue with babies under their arms and blood drifting from their fanged teeth, that kind of thing. I mean, that was what we were subjected to. And we were obviously never under real threat of invasion, but that was the scare tactic that was used. So that left a deep impression on us. And we were the silent generation college students. And think about it. I mean, as I think back about it, I'm so ashamed, but I guess not ashamed enough to, I'm ashamed, but not, it hasn't ruined my life. But the college controlled the men by controlling the women. There were no rules for men. We had maids that would sometimes make our beds. We had maid service. The women didn't have that kind of service, and they got locked up as freshmen at 8 o'clock at night, and upper class students at 10 o'clock at night. And the guys came back to the dorms at 10 o'clock at night. Guess what? The women were locked up, so the interest was gone out on campus, and they came back to the dorms. So women were relatively well under control. Well, relatively, not totally by any means. And the women were really tightly controlled. And the league board women, the dorm presidents, had to administer those college rules. I mean, the college co-opted students to carry out, and they made decisions that led to expulsion of students. That's what they had to do. The C of HP, the men house presidents, had the same, instructions, but they didn't carry them out with nearly as much force as the women did, because the women really were under control. The question is, and I've asked those women, and Sue was on league board a couple of years later, did you resist that? Did you think it was wrong? Well, MJ's going to be on this panel this afternoon. She's shaking her head no. This is what they were asked to do, and these were the parietal regulations that dominated most college campuses, and so we have the privilege of administering them. Now, I'm sure people had different attitudes toward that, but I'm just trying to create a picture of what it was like in the 50s, and we were that silent, accepting generation who were taught to adjust. If circumstances are not to your liking, do you change them? No, you adjust to them. That was more or less the attitude that we had. We were an adjusting and adjustable generation. Now, you folks from 1967, you're probably most of you born about 1945, 46. Post-war, Now, you're born into families that were deeply affected by the war, by fathers, in some cases mothers, who had been in the service. I mean, we had 11 million or more in the service in World War II. The war had an effect on you, but not the same effect that it had on us, because you couldn't remember it. You didn't experience it. I think that's a significant difference to sort of understand what's going to come in the 60s. That you are not as, well, shall I say, I don't know, not downtrodden's not the word, not the right word, but you are not as subjected or accepting of regulations, I think, because of your conditioning, as we were in the 50s. I mean, I'm just trying to, as an historian, figure out why we're going to go through such a big change. The pill. We never even thought of a pill in the 50s. And a lot of the guys did not want to impregnate a woman because that entailed some responsibility. And I mean, we had the same sex drives that any kids have. And believe me, there was a lot of sex on campus. But it was hard to find a place for it. It was generally frowned upon, not only by the society in general, but by students. Not so much the men, but the women. We didn't want to be labeled a slut by your contemporaries. And for the women, the fear of pregnancy, that's a wonderful behavioral modifier. Probably as strong a behavioral modifier as you can have. And not that there weren't means of birth control, but most of them with condoms were in the hands of the men, not of the women, whereas the pill puts you in charge of your own destiny. That's a difference that's going to come about, and I think helps us to understand some of the changing norms as you get into the 60s and the 70s. Then, and this is the 900-pound gorilla in the room, Vietnam, where we, having grown up worshiping older brothers in the service, I had an older brother in the Navy, and wishing, my mother made me a Navy uniform. I was a first-class seaman when my brother was a third-class seaman. I proudly wore that every Sunday, my Navy uniform. I couldn't wait. Too bad this war's going to finish before I come along. That was my attitude toward that war. That was not the attitude of students in the 60s toward Vietnam. And I became a dean at Colorado, the dean of the faculty at Colorado College in '67 until '73. So I functioned as an administrator in that height of that Vietnam War generation. And it was excoriating. I mean, I don't have to tell you, you younger folk, you're younger than me anyway, what it's like. And as none of you approach, I mean, finally it became, quote, fair, the lottery. You no longer had a student deferment. So you were going to go through that lottery, and depending on the number you got, you were either going to go into the service and be probably obliged to fight in a war that you absolutely hated, saw no justification for. So are you going to go to Canada? What are you going to do? I mean, that was such a disrupting force for our society. And it hit college generation kids so hard. And what's easy for you to do if you're in that situation, you become anti-establishment. The mantra then, don't trust anyone over 30. The reason was someone over 30 might have kids and then begin to think like a parent rather than a kid. And if you were part of, and I've experienced this as a dean at CC, if you were part of the establishment, and certainly the college administration is the closest establishment you've got at hand. The belief of students was you were automatically corrupt if you were part of that establishment. You couldn't be anything but corrupt if you were willing to do that. And you're not making the war, but you're establishmentarian in the eyes of students. And so when you're going to strike out, you're going to strike out at what's closest to hand. And the college administration and the college, establishment is the thing that is to hand. So I think that contributed a lot. And of course, this builds you folks for 67 are there at the beginning of this building. And what I'm going to argue today is that you are on the cusp of the revolution. The revolution is going to get more revolutionary after you. But you're on the cusp of it, and we're going to have this discussion this afternoon. And what inspired that was when members of the class of 67 heard from Mimi what was going to be the topic of this talk. A lot of them said, no, it wasn't a revolution. It wasn't so revolutionary. So was it a revolution or not? I'm here saying, yeah, it was a revolution. And this afternoon we'll sort of discuss whether, in fact, from your point of view, you people who lived through it, it was or was not. So this is the sort of general framework I want to have us keep in mind as I then get into some specifics from those trustee minutes. So it's going to get a little I hope I don't bore you with, I have to tell you, reading trustee minutes is not the most exciting activity I've ever had. I'll never forget when I was president, we had a guy named Denny Homeran who was our sort of active lawyer on the board. A lot of you people know Denny. And so my secretary would take the minutes. They were really pretty interesting. When Denny finished with them, there was nothing of interest in those minutes. It was so whitewashed. Pretty much only what was decided. Formal decisions were left in the minutes. Now, they're more interesting for an earlier period and a less litigious period when trustees weren't automatically thinking, what if a lawyer gets hold of these minutes? What can I do with them? And as a trustee, you have a lot, they have, I forget the formal name for it, but they have insurance to protect them from lawsuits and so on, because ultimately if there's going to be a suit against Grinnell, it oftentimes will end in the trustee's lap, because they are the corporation. They are the college, and in one sense, in the legal sense of the word, it's the trustees are the ones you can get at. So the minutes do get sanitized pretty heavily. But what I found in these minutes for, as you're getting into the 1960s, and I'm only going to talk about the 60s at the moment, and then we'll get into the 70s. We're in Howard Bowen's time. Howard became the president of Grinnell in 1955, which was for the class of 56, our senior year. We had 3 presidents when I was here, the tail end of Sam Stevens and Rupert Hawke for a year as an interim, and then we got Howard. And it was, I can tell you, it was like a breath of fresh air. The college was really in deep trouble at that time. I'm surprised they attracted a person of Howard's caliber to take this on, because it was a rescue operation. And there was a sense of a breath of fresh air had arrived on campus. We sensed that as students, and I got to know Howard a little. My big issue then was, let's have co-ed dining once a week. And I approached the president. We actually helped us to do that. Howard was pretty good. But that was my only real contribution to our college time, anyway. And as you read the minutes, in most regards, Howard does not make a misstep. The college, what he essentially does is transform Grinnell into from a struggling regional institution into an arriving national institution. His sites were national, not regional, and his experience was national, not regional. He came to us directly from Williams College. And the Ford Foundation is in the minutes a lot. I never saw the Ford Foundation there before Howard arrived. National foundations, in other words, the possibility of raising money that way and so on. It's just a new world that comes. The econ department was in bad trouble, and he made it into one of the great econ departments in the country, which it still is. It's extraordinary what happens at Howard. And I think of George Gates in the late 19th century and Howard Bowen were the seminal presidencies of Grinnell. Every once in a while it comes along that just, if that person hadn't been there, you wonder what would have become of the college. George Gates, you look at his inaugural address, and the college that we like to be is there in that address. He's helping to shape it into what it became. And then when you look at Howard's work, you see some of the same things. Well, first thing, I mean, this is a presidential initiative. He eliminated hazing in 1960. Now, that's an important transformation. Again, those of us brought up in World War II, you're going to come and you're going to get your butt pounded every Monday night. I mean, we had to go downtown and buy a packet of paddles, 5 paddles at the lumberyard, and then those will all be broken on us on Monday nights for various and sundry infractions. And we had to go through a hell week and so on. But that made me into a North Yonker man. North Yonker for 4 years, and that's one of the things that the old alums haven't liked about co-ed living, because you jumble around from dorm to dorm. What's that? I mean, here I got to live in North Yonker for 4 years with those wonderful people, but I had to pass my initiation in order to live with them. We accepted it. The Honor G initiation, I won't even tell you about it, except that we were naked the whole night, and again, we took it. But we had learned in World War II to adjust. This is what it took to be a Grinnell student. Let's do it. But you get into the 60s, and Howard, who was a very proper man, and many of you in this room knew him pretty well, a very proper man. And Howard didn't like that, and he did away with it. So there's a major shift moving toward the 20th century in 1960. And you see in the trustee minutes that the students are beginning to push for 4 things: the elimination of women's hours, easing the alcohol rules, allowing cars, and allowing dorm visitation. So this is when I talk about the cusp, these were the issues on the cusp of the student revolution, having to do with the day-to-day normal lives that students are going to live. Then I think some of you will remember the drunkenness at the Boar's Head dinner, 1960-61. And that hit the trustee minutes. And sort of abhorrence at this student behavior. Again, Gracie Hunter's wonderful medieval tradition brought to Grinnell College, which again in the 50s was honored and accepted, is beginning to be dishonored in its, the forms are there, but the spirit is gone as you get into the early 60s with this traditional Christmas dinner where I waited in cold, I got to carry the Boar's Head in, singing the Boar's Head hymn and so on. I thought it was great. I didn't even think about it. But Bowen's response is interesting. At one point in the trustee minutes, this is 1963, so you folks in 67 are getting close to this. His response is, I will negotiate with the students when they improve their behavior. They have not earned the right to negotiate with me because of their bad behavior. And so that's Howard's stance. And what the story I'm going to tell you is this is where Howard had a tough time crossing that Rubicon, dealing with student misbehavior and with a new generation of students. It was very difficult for Howard. And he those of us who knew him, he was a pretty stiff, formal, proper man. And impropriety really bothered him. Renard, Renard's here. The student impropriety bothers Renard. He's been very good at saying to students, respect. We move forward on a basis of mutual respect. And until we get to that point, we're not going to get where we want to be. And Renard's been a very good breath of fresh air on our campus with the students in terms of, we're adults. Let's act like adults as we approach these problems. So I can say Renard's a little more loose with respect to how you have to negotiate with students than Howard was. Then I'm going to detail this in a few minutes, but there's a wonderful story of the dorm that never was. Because Howard is broaching in 1963 the need for a new 100-bed dormitory. And he wants to bring every student who's living out in Grinnell, the town, onto campus. We will become a community. And again, Howard had a wonderful concept of, idealized concept of community. Howard hired Georgia Dental. If you're going to bring students from all over the country and all over the world to little old Grinnell, Iowa, in the cornfields, you better have a very active cultural program on campus to make it, you've got an advantage. You've got this, they're here, not going home on the weekends. Let's do something really interesting on our weekends. And so we had, one of the best cultural events programs in the country with Georgia Dental, and that was Howard's idea. And so he wanted to let's be a full community. Let's not have 100 or 150 students living out in town. Let's bring everybody back on campus. In June of '63, just before you folks arrive, see you folks, I'm talking to '67 here, Howard announces with some relief that Grinnell is not alone, that he's learned that Carleton and Lake Forest and Swarthmore and Vassar and Radcliffe, he says, quote, there seems to be changing student attitudes towards sex mores and adult authority over their actions. Seems to be changing student mores. So Howard appointed a faculty committee, and they come back to investigate and make a recommendation to the administration. And the faculty committee, you may or may not remember this, suggests, or their finding is they should eliminate closing hours for women. This is in 1963 that these folks report. Cars for seniors not on financial aid should be allowed. Now, that is really telling. That's Grinnell through and through and through. Trying to create some sort of democracy on this campus. And in the 20s, I'm reading the S&B and so on for the 20s, looking for Joe biography. They're talking about cars then, and just a very few folks were rich enough to have cars. And the reason not to have them was that it would then set them apart from the rest of the student body. There's a lot of talk about democracy in the 20s and what's democratic and what's not. They had a secret fraternity on campus of athletes. And the S&B was all over them because of their undemocratic nature. I mean, it's that element of Grinnell is definitely there. Then the third recommendation here of this faculty committee is women and men's dorm lounges for specified times after dinner. That'd be a big breakthrough. I can tell you, Sue and I were on campus in '60-61. I was a sabbatical replacement. And those are still the days when you had to have chaperones for house parties and so on. And we were connected to Rawson. And I'll never forget, we were such easy marks, such easy marks. We were in Rawson Lounge, a real nice thing, and sitting around talking with people, and all of a sudden there were these students who were really engaging us in serious conversation, and we looked around and there wasn't anybody there. I guess they were upstairs. We didn't go looking. Looking for them. But so this was 1960-61, so things are happening. Well, let me tell you just very quickly the story of this dormitory. Howard has suggested it in the fall of October 1963, and then he promptly left. In November of 1963, Reynard, this had happened for you. The Carnegie Foundation had a presidential world tour program, and Howard and Lois were gone for 4 months traveling around the world under the auspices of the Carnegie Foundation. And Jim Stouse was the acting president. So Jim comes in November and says, well, actually, what we're thinking of is 150 beds, and it should be all women, and it'll be built going west from Luce. So you create the quadrangle, you finish the quadrangle effect of South Campus, was the way that dorm was going to go. So that's approved. Then they moved now, without giving you all these dates, they're going to go up to 68. And believe it or not, it goes for 5 years. And they hire SOM, the Skidmoreans and Merrill, Howard's favorite architects, to do the building. And it's priced at $4,175,000, by far the most expensive dorm that had would be ever built at the college. They had hired not only the architects, had not only priced it, but they hired a contractor. They're ready to go. And then in June of 1968, John Norris, chair of the Buildings and Grounds Committee, says that we may hold off on this dorm for a little bit because of possible changing concepts of residential living and the ability of the town to provide housing capacity for students and the response of students to new changes in the residential system. We're going to have co-ed dorms in another year. So the trustees are merrily going along, deciding and voting, but the students are really doing the voting. Metaphorically, they're voting with their feet. They aren't going to do it. They aren't going to come in from living out in town as upper-class students, and they're right on the verge of getting co-ed dorms. And the whole residential system is now topsy-turvy. Who knows what's going to happen? So it's an interesting saga. I see it as emblematic of the period, that up until now, the trustees have been able to decide and do things. But on something like residential living, the decision now is increasingly in the hands of the students. One point I want to make here is a call out to Karen Lauterbach-Williams. When I met with those folks, Mimi and her committee, they told me this story. I've got it in the Rosenfield book. It's in there. They said, you know how the dorm closing hours got changed at Grinnell? Oh, I didn't know. I knew they got changed. Well, we've been agitating, and then Karen called the fire marshal and said, you know, I'm paraphrasing here, you know what this college is doing? They're locking us up at 10 o'clock at night. A week later, the rules were changed. I think that's a wonderful Grinnell story, and it's brilliant. I have to, Renard, I have to put ourselves in that position. What if they did it to us? I'd like to think, I would think, well, that's pretty smart. I probably would have been mad. But again, the students are making the decision, not the college administrators, or in this case, faculty. So these are the sorts of things that are happening while you folks are the cusp of driving this process. And you know, you can't claim the most outrageous things that were done on campus, but you prepared the way for it. You can take great pride in the outrages that followed. I mean, for example, our dorms were not set up to be co-ed, particularly if you're going to move from floor by floor to room by room. Bathrooms, 1 bathroom per floor. You mean to say that if I live on the first floor and I'm a woman, I've got to go up to the 2nd floor to use the bathroom every time? Students are going to vote with their feet. They aren't going to do it. So they create the dial-a-john. Woman, don't care who comes in. Woman, only woman, that kind of thing. And I don't know how faithful students were at observing the dial-a-john. But that was, and Grinnell became notorious. I was sitting out at Howard College and I hear about that and whoa. Co-ed bathrooms at Grinnell? It just blew my mind. But as soon as we had co-ed dorms, virtually we had co-ed bathroom. Now, when we renovated the dorms, we added bathrooms for obvious reasons, so that people wouldn't be quite as driven to make these decisions as in fact was the case for students from the late 60s on. 68, SDS shows up on campus. 1969, the Playboy incident. I don't think there's a person in this room that doesn't know what the Playboy incident was, but I'll explain it. There may be some younger folks here. Hugh Hefner's number 2 came to campus. and several women disrobed in front of him. And due to Henry Wilhelm and others, there were photographers on the scene to take the photos, and those photos, I think they appeared in the New York Times, if I'm not mistaken. But Grinnell, everyone in the country knew about it. This disrobing in front of the Playboy. But there was a purpose to it, but most people just thought, this college is really spinning off into some sort of alternative universe. Then Richard Turner, the Attorney General of Iowa, decided that there should be an investigation of Grinnell. FBI agents began to appear on campus. So, Grinnell wasn't quite Berkeley, but I can tell you, sitting in Colorado Springs, and by this time I'm an administrator. No, not quite yet. No, I shouldn't claim that. But Colorado College student body is a little more conservative than the Grinnell student body, but they had Fort Carson right at the gates, and all sorts of military things. So they went out and demonstrated and did some pretty radical. I can remember walking with students through Ed Air Force Base, which is now the Olympic Training Center, with MPs on the top of buildings with automatic weapons watching us as we walked through, paraded through anti-war demonstration. So I kept saying, I'm so glad the Grinnell student body isn't here. No telling what they would do. They would have done more than the CC student body, I think. Spring of 1970, no commencement. College closes 2 weeks before the end of the school year. Now that was a difficult thing to do for a lot of reasons. All the faculty had to figure out how to get students through their courses and so on. And of course, the students of that time, graduates, had to miss their commencement. Some of them agreed with that, some of them didn't. But the feeling of the administration and then on the board, and Joe, who makes the vote of support of makes the motion to support the administration, Joe Rosenfield made that motion. And they were supported by the board with the decision to close the college. Kent State, bombing of Cambodia, the thought was the atmosphere here is too violent to go on, so we're going to close the college. I want to step back a little bit to your time again, the 60s. The 1966 yearbook. Again, Henry's here, Henry Wilhelm is here. Henry approached me in 1986 with what are the blue lines, is that what they're called, Henry, anyway, the photographs that he and John Phillips had done for the 66 yearbook. I saw those, and they were the greatest set of photos of Grinnell life and of the Grinnell campus I'd ever seen. They should see the light of day, so I came up with the funds to get the thing published in 1986. It wasn't published in 66 because the administration decided that some students would be vulnerable to a lawsuit or to litigation because they could be seen smoking pot in a photo. That was, I think, the basic thing the lawyers were saying. Glenn Leggett had to make that decision. His own inauguration is portrayed in the book, and so he had some skin in the game in that sense. What is wonderful, if you've never seen that 66 yearbook, do try to get a copy. I think they're still available in the bookstore. It captures Grinnell at this tipping point. The college that I remember is there. The guys in Rawson and Gates having a piano bashing contest. See who can go most quickly destroy a piano and pass all the pieces through the judging square. And this done before a bonfire out on back field. That's the kind of crap that I can remember as a student. It was kind of typical of our behavior. And Henry's editorial acumen is just visible throughout this book. The very next set of pictures is Marilyn Drake working with an autistic child in ARH. Social concern, social justice, students doing good things rather than destructive things. And it's throughout that book, because the college that I attended is in there. It's still there by 66, some of it. But the college that it's going to become is also in there. And we're so lucky to have that moment captured in those photos and in that book. So it's an historical document. Joe Wall writes an introduction to it, and very good at recognizing, obviously with Joe, the historical importance of that book and the transformation of an institution. All right, well, to go on to see where I'm going to stop here in just a few minutes. I'm not going to go on forever, and we'll start having questions and dialogue back and forth. Think of probably the most, in terms of lasting positivity, the most important thing that happened in this period was curricular change. The curricular change worked out in 1970 and then instituted in 1971. That curriculum is still the curriculum of Grinnell College. Think about that. This is the period when, at College, we had constant agitation to get rid of grades, get rid of grades, get rid of grades. That was going on at Grinnell, but the faculty did not go that direction. But getting rid of requirements was what was done. And Burl Klopfeller, a physics professor of all things, tremendously well respected, was the one who came up with that idea, that design. And then Al Jones and Lowy and Barry Zigas worked on the thing called the tutorial with that. And I can tell you from personal experience that the tutorial is, in a sense, if you don't like the openness of the curriculum at Grinnell, what saves it is the tutorial. Because it creates a juxtaposition of teaching and advising. You got to do that to have advising work. A student is going to listen much more carefully to someone that's a teacher as well as an advisor. And that's what happened, because your tutorial students become your advisees until they declare a major. And it works. They even do what you tell them to do when they first arrive. When we used to have visible registrations, history was here in Harris Center, over in that room across the way, and math was here. So the math lines are right up in front of history, and I'd say to my colleagues, look at the longest lines here are in front of math in this no requirements college. Everyone's taking calculus. We have strong, remarkably strong language departments, no language requirements. So every time that the faculty sits down, and Bill, I think you would agree with this, to talk about changing, going to a more structured curriculum, when in fact the students are really doing things in a fairly structured way, why change it? We'd much rather have volunteers than conscripts in your class. And through the tutorial, we get them started in a pretty good direction. Now, I can tell you, and you would know this, after that first semester, it's Katie by the door. They've talked to people, and they know which professors they want, and so on and so on. So it's a negotiation from then on, but pretty much you're telling them in that first tutorial meeting. We've done transcript analyses, and probably about 10% of the transcripts are sort of aberrant with respect to a liberal arts college, but 85 to 90% looks like we have a bunch of requirements here at Grinnell. So it's working. We're one of maybe only 2 institutions from the 1970s that's retained that curriculum of the 70s. We're still functioning with the 70s structure. The courses have changed tremendously, but the structure of our curriculum is a 1970s. It was created by that student revolution. The students drove it. The faculty decided. And at College, it was interesting. I remember as dean, the students decided that they would have a town meeting to decide on the curriculum. Because after all, they're the majority. We're a democracy, shouldn't they? And I remember standing up in front of them before they took a vote, and I said, you can vote till the cows come home. The faculty's going to decide. Boo, hiss, get off the stage. And then they had jackbooted people, it seemed to me, walking up and down on the vote. But these finky students would rather have structure than the open curriculum. It was interesting. They didn't win their case in the town meeting, not that they could have actually changed it. But, that was the environment of the time, was we are the majority, we're a democracy, we should decide. And students are going to become, SEPC, Student Educational Policy Committee. They're getting, they do, and still to today, are in on personnel decisions. But of course, informally, they're hugely into it because they've got all of these things online about rate your professor sorts of things. And they can go online and get the general gist of what students are saying about every single faculty member. So the voice of students is there. I mean, and it's changed a lot of late. It's not as wild as it was in the 70s and 80s, but it nevertheless is transforming of the institution. So I'm going to avoid the temptation of talking about the issues that I confronted as president, such as South African divestment, which went on for 15 years and which led to invasions of board meetings and board members, Renard, having to walk a gauntlet to get to the board meeting of students cheering at them over divestment. Renard has his own divestment issues now on fossil fuels and so on, which I will say I think he's handling very well. It's been an very open discussion involving the board and the students, and I think is not going to lead to anything like the tension we experienced over South Africa. But I'm going to stop now. My contention, my thesis, is that there was a revolution. It really did change, and a lot of my thesis depends on how different the 50s were from what's going to happen with the 60s and 70s. So having said that, and this leaves us with 20 to 25 minutes or so for dialogue back and forth. So I will stop, and we have, I think, 2 mics, one in each aisle. These guys are going to decide who gets to ask the question. I don't have to make that decision. But they've told me I can't wander around because they're filming this, so I have to stay right here.
George, thank you so much, and glad that our class voted to have this. My question, just quickly, because I'm a student of history too, when we look at the 50s, we look at women's history, and the background of the 60s is there. Statistically, women are leaving the home and going to work. So, I mean, it's building during the 50s. So my question to you is, you jumped over, and I understand that, but the so-called forgotten war and how that affected your generation, Korea.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could talk about that.
Korea. The question is about how Korea affected my generation. I can tell you, it's interesting just to mention from the trustee minutes. When you think of the ride the college has been on, by the time you even get to the 50s, Depression. Joe became a trustee 8 days before Pearl Harbor. So Depression, then you got World War II. And virtually the men disappear. So the college is in danger of collapsing. So, and it's Joe who makes the motion, go off to Sam Stevens, go off to Washington and see if you can get a military unit. We did. We got an Army unit, 700 and some guys show up on campus, and the college survives. Then the Depression babies come, and Korea. And they're scared to death that the same is going to happen with Korea that happened with World War II. They're going to lose all the men. What are the men doing? I was coming in, we had college deferments then. And so at my high school, which was Lyons Township High School in LaGrange, Illinois, had a junior college. And a lot of guys were starting to take junior college courses in order to create a seamless transition from high school to college, in order to avoid the draft. The fact of the matter, it did affect us. And the main way it affected us was, again, the trustees instructed Sam Stevens to go off and get a military unit, and we got an ROTC unit, Air Force ROTC, which when I arrived in the fall of '52, I thought must have been here forever. Well, it'd been there 1 year. And every one of us, guys, was in that unit as first and second year, freshmen and sophomores. I had my uniform. I wore my uniform every Tuesday and Thursday. I marched every Tuesday and Thursday. My flight leader, this is Air Force ROTC, was a guy named Tom Railsback, who became a state representative from the state of Illinois, was on the House Judiciary Committee during the Watergate hearings. He was a Republican who actually voted for impeachment. About tore him up. But he was a happy-go-lucky flight leader. He used to march us into the dorms, literally into the dorms. He wouldn't turn us around. We'd just pile up against the dorm. we had to march every morning. We took military science. The only thing I can remember from military science is the altitude, which I've kind of forgotten now, the best altitude for exploding a nuclear weapon and for the most maximum destruction. That kind of stuff was what we would learn in those courses. So ROTC came, and that was a major factor in keeping guys in college. So that was a big effect. And then, of course, in the 70s, ROTC is going to become a pariah on campus. The only physically destructive action on the campus was student occupation of the ROTC offices, and a window was broken. I wasn't here then, but that's what I'm told. That was the only physical destruction that happened in anti-Vietnam demonstrations. So it didn't have, the fear was huge of the college officials, because it compounded with depression babies. It looked like another threat, World War II style threat, but it didn't quite transpire. And we had a lot of veterans coming back, or people who got drafted. Foster Reinford came for the early part of the alumni college. A lot of people, Foster was drafted and was off for 2 years and came back. Chris Nielsen from my class. They were older than we were. Gordon Packard, I think, was in the service in the middle of his college career. So it did affect some people, for sure.
George, thanks a lot for your presentation. I wonder how you would evaluate the role of the civil rights movement in the changes during the 1960s.
Huge. And in the interest of time, and it's maybe unfair of me, I didn't go into the long saga of the board minutes with respect to students of color. But as we know, some students went to Washington during that period. Some students went off campus to in civil rights activities. I think it would be a mistake to try to argue that Grinnell was somehow a leading light in that respect over a lot of institutions, but was certainly very active in terms of activities off campus in the civil rights movement, and then huge on campus. Those of us from the 50s remember the handful of students of color on our campus, and some of them were international students. By the time you hit the 60s, in other words, as a result of the civil rights movement, there is tremendous pressure on the administration, the faculty, and the trustees to greatly and significantly increase the number of black students. And it's interesting, in the board minutes, a minority is what we talked about then, was defined as black at Grinnell, almost exclusively. In fact, Howard Bowen became a trustee in the 70s, and there was a very challenging moment in the trustee minutes, and I remember it from hearing him. Howard says, what about Hispanic students? What about Native American students? Why are we just talking about black students in our conversation? And Grinnell, by the time you get to the early 70s, Grinnell is making absolutely concerted efforts to greatly enlarge the number of black students. They got a Rockefeller grant, and in the early 70s, they used that grant to attract what would have to be, I think, quite literally described, ghetto black students, particularly from Chicago. And the numbers expanded rather significantly, but the tension was just palpable, and it was a very difficult time for the college. The college did not have the infrastructure, the support system, and so on to make that work very well. The black students wanted a black dorm, and the college said no, but then they turned Yonkers into black clusters. There were black clusters in Yonkers. I have my nephew, Mitch Erickson, is a 72 graduate, lived in Yonkers, and he said it was a very tense dorm in that period. And he's a very liberal kid, a super liberal kid. But he also, it wasn't working very well. And without boring you with the details of that, when I was president, we were maybe getting up to 10% students of color. And beginning to recognize this wasn't going to work without instrumental things, institutional changes and so on that needed to make this work. And one of the wonderful, wonderful things about Grinnell today is that we're finally beginning to deal effectively with that issue. We have about 20% students of color, non-international, and another significant number of international students of color. And you want to get to that critical mass. We talk about critical mass. And I think we're close now. In other words, when you walk around campus, you don't say, oh, there's a black student, or there's a Hispanic student, or something. Those internal dialogues no longer happen. You're just seeing students. And that's a wonderful place to get to. And believe me, it's not easy for a school in the cornfields of Iowa. And it's taken a lot of effort and a lot of people devoted to it, I'd say, and a long time. The black graduates that I worked with, alums, were among our most distinguished graduates. And almost to a person they would say, I did not enjoy my time at Grinnell. I don't feel warm and fuzzy about Grinnell, but Grinnell gave me the education that allowed me to get where I am today. So I'm deeply grateful, but I didn't have fun. And they're very blunt about it. But wonderful. I mean, we did. For some students, we did very well in terms of educating. Whether we did very well in terms of providing the environment, we ought to have done, I don't think. But
hi, George. I'm Bob Wagner.
Hi, Bob.
You and I were born in the same year, and we were classmates at Grinnell. So I appreciate a lot of your perspectives that have come through the same life cycle that I have. But following on your discussion recently, I know you spent some time in South Africa. Lesotho, was it?
Yes, in Lesotho, yeah.
Yeah, could you tell us some of the feelings you could bring back to Grinnell from South Africa in those days?
Well, yes. What Bob is referring to is that I did something, I guess, a little unusual as an ex-college president. I went off to the Peace Corps with Sue. And it took a while to persuade the folks in Washington that we would, as ex-college president, would just do whatever a Peace Corps volunteer does. When we finally got to that point, we did get an assignment. And Sue, we were in the mountain kingdom of Lesotho, which is totally surrounded by South Africa. There are only 3 enclaves in the world, and Lesotho is one of them, totally surrounded by South Africa. And Sue was what's called a primary resource teacher, and we lived out in a village area, and she moved into the villages on horseback, actually, working with teachers. She's a former second grade teacher. I just, in a way, mine was a less interesting and probably less important job. I was a high school English teacher, and I walked a couple hundred meters to school every day from our house, and I simply was replacing the host country national. And one of the things, and this gets to the point, Bob, one of the things I was most interested in was whether divestment and the boycotts of South Africa did any good. The trustee meetings we had were really interesting. Some of the trustees had been to South Africa, and some would say, yeah, but the blacks are going to be hurt more by the decline in the economy that these boycotts and divestment will create. And we shouldn't be doing that. And others would say, yeah, but the blacks know that, and they want it done anyway. We didn't know what we were doing. One of the things that made me most proud of our board, it's a tremendous board of trustees, it always has been. One meeting they said, we're not very good at divestment, we're good at education. Let's educate black South Africans. And Harvard had a program that was bringing black South Africans to the U.S. for education. We had to provide full ride, tuition, board and room, books, and everything. And we took more students than any institution in the country. At one point, we had 4 a year. So we had 12 to 15 black South Africans in our student body. I can tell you the temperature of those demonstrations went up like that. The blacks at first thought they couldn't really demonstrate against the white administration, and they learned you could get away with that at Grinnell. And they got very involved. And I remember one meeting, the board was meeting in main lounge, and the students were outside in the hallway out there waiting for the result of a divestment. No divestment was the decision. They said, George, go out and tell the students. So I went out and told them, and the black South Africans started crying. It was just, wailing. I mean, that really adds points to the issue. So now to answer the question, I'm convinced that boycotts did have an effect, because we were there essentially in South Africa from 91 to 93, just on the cusp of the elections. Mandela's out of prison in February of 1990. And the pressure on the government from the business community was intense. The pressure was this: we can't go on like this. We are the pariahs of the world. Our economy is suffering, and it was. There was a recession. We've got to change. So I think that the international sanctions did have a real impact on South Africa. Yeah.
Hi, I was wondering if you'd comment on curricular change. So it's my impression in the Howard Bowen years that the curriculum became more and more liberal arts, big idea curriculum based on Western civilization, humanities, historical studies, economics, not accounting, not practical or technical courses. And how's that changed since the Howard Bowen years?
First of all, I'll say you're right about the Howard Bowen years. I got to teach early on in the historical studies sequence, which I thought was a wonderful course. But as much as was going on at the college, it was very Western. And it didn't change. When I was a history student at Grinnell, you could take European history, you could take American history, and I guess Russian history. That was it. British, yeah, we could do, yeah, you're right, British history, but that's European. So at least Brexit folks may not think so, but so no Latin America, no Africa, no Asia, no East Asia.
I took a course in African history from Ray Betts.
You did? Well, 50s there wasn't. So it stayed pretty Western and pretty classical. And you're right about Howard. I mean, we had a business major when I was a student, and Howard did away with. He didn't. He was too practical. They got rid of elementary education, which we've done again. Up to I think it's a terrible decision, but and Reynard had nothing to do with that. That came before Reynard's time, which I think, frankly, was snobbery. The colleges that Howard wanted us to, our comparison group changed. It changed to the Little Ivies and so on, and those places didn't mess around with education, and they didn't mess around with a lot of practical things. So as we raised our sights to become more like the best national institutions, we began to emulate them, I think, in our curriculum. So the question now is what's going on with the curriculum? And I have to say, I'm not the great authority on it. I don't go to faculty meetings or department meetings anymore, but I am teaching, and I do have advisees, and I'm hanging around. So. It's really, I mean, what are I think the biggest transformation in Grinnell is the way we teach. It is almost across the board interactive teaching, which is harder teaching to do than getting up there and preparing your lecture and giving a lecture. Not that it was ever always that, but there's much less lecturing on campus now than there was. A great example of that is the way the structure of courses has changed. I've got really frustrated this year in registering students, and Reynard's well aware of this, that when we dropped Saturday classes, which happened on my watch, we went to Tuesday, Thursday, and longer class periods, obviously. Hour and 20 minutes, hour and a half, that sort of thing. But we had Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 50-minute classes. Now we have all these Monday, Wednesday classes, hour and a half, or Wednesday, Friday classes, hour and a half. What makes it hard in registration is those always take up 2 of those slots, and trying to find open slots is really difficult now. Why are we doing that? Faculty are teaching interactively, and it's much better to have the longer period, because you just get the discussion properly going in a 50-minute class, and you got to leave. So that's the best sign I can point to about changing styles. So I would hate to be a full-time faculty member here now, because you are expected to be a scholar and to be a productive scholar, not like a major university, but to be a productive scholar. Teaching at Grinnell is as demanding, probably more demanding than ever. You have a family, And, you know, I mean, doesn't sound like much, you know, 1 or 2 classes a day, maybe at most 3. But all of that goes into that. It is a really intense life. And it means that, you know, the Al Jones style of faculty member who's running the college, which I benefited from, I mean, there were probably a half a dozen faculty when I was president and well before my time who made it their business to bird dog the president every step of the way. And it was their college. They cared. And they tried to run it as much as possible. It's hard for the faculty to find the time now. And one of the frustrations that someone like Renard has, that they aren't as engaged, but then when they get engaged, all of a sudden there's a little bit of a flash. And it's you don't have the consistency, I think, of that kind of intense involvement. But you can't. There just isn't enough time. So that's a change. There's a much more interdisciplinary work now. New majors like biochemistry. I mean, that's a great example of an interdisciplinary approach. Much more support for faculty who have, all kinds of little funds around now, and invitations coming out from the dean's office. If you want to develop this kind of course, we can support it. Or there is some consortiums that you can go to learn. There's a lot of training of faculty. This college does a better job of training its faculty than any institution I'm aware of. Workshops in the summer for week-long workshops where you can work on new techniques and so on. I did one a couple of summers ago and learned some things about the teaching of writing that I've used in the tutorial to great advantage. We learn from each other. And I'm so impressed with our faculty and the quality of them and their dedication. And I don't know how they do it, because faculty are always wailing about, and if you're outside of academia, you wonder, what are they wailing about? And they got all summer off and, all of these things. And it's a great life. I love it. I love it. And I'm still hanging on trying to do it. But it is demanding in a place like Grinnell where these students really expect the best, and we try to give it to them.
George, this is a magisterial performance, and we thank you very much for it. I'd like to take you back to what the 60s did to us and the early 70s, and the extent to which, even within our own constituency of alums, the gap that is apparent between I hesitate to call it the right and the left in our politics, exists within our own constituency. And there are many people, I think, who, when they talk to crazy radicals like me or hear about them, are very concerned about America not being great anymore like it was in the 1950s. And do you see that within our constituency, and do you see any guidance for us to how to get back together to at least talking about the same planet?
Well, Hal, that's a very good question. Hal, who's a newspaper guy, lawyer, trustee, and so on, and this is a pretty existential question for him. Are we any better than anybody else? That's part of the question in terms of being able to talk to each other. And I would like, my first answer is I'd like to think so, but I don't have any authoritative response to that. I think of my own class. I mean, if you go back to the 50s, we were a much more conservative group of people. And if you had sort of polls or little elections on campus, our class would have voted Eisenhower, Eisenhower, Eisenhower all the way. And some people would have been to the right, and Eisenhower wasn't very far right. I mean, we'd love to see some folks from that party that were like Eisenhower now. Excuse me. See, I'm just as bad as everybody else. And when 9/11 happened, one of our more radical faculty members, an NYU professor, said, I was walking around New York today and we got exactly what we deserved. you should have seen our class letters. I mean, I think the alumni office had to handle them with tweezers. They were just toxic, those letters, over someone who would say that. And everyone knew the person very well who said it. It was typical of him to say it. He, by the way, had to stay all 4 years at ROTC because he kept getting so many demerits he couldn't get out. Had to march all the time with, Charlie. Anyway, so we were treated to that kind of thing over that issue, and I think the alumni office since that time has worked pretty hard to try to keep that kind of stuff from polluting, I guess, the class letters. It's pretty hard. How far can you edit the class letter? It's pretty hard to do that. But so that was not well handled by our class because the things that were in that letter were really pretty toxic. We weren't talking to each other, we were writing to each other. So that demonstration, it doesn't, put Grinnell in a very good light, just the fact that we're good liberal arts graduates. But I would like to think, some of you, I'm sure, were here yesterday for the prison panel. And we had two ex-cons who'd gone through the Grinnell course and who are Grinnellians and self-identify as Grinnellians. And they were really a wonderful guide to us because they said they learned how to talk to each other in a reasonable way and question each other in a reasonable way through taking those Grinnell courses in the prison. And it changed their mode of argument and behavior. Would that all of us could take it on as well as they did. And anybody's answer out there would be as good as mine about whether, in fact, I would hope that being liberal arts graduates and doing the kind of work that we did as students at this college and having the influence of this institution would make us more able to speak to people of different persuasions.
Thank you for this elegant lecture. Your choice of the word revolution is obviously important and deliberate. It's a very powerful word, and I was interested in if you could perhaps help us to understand the nugget of what enables a person to classify something that might otherwise be called a transformation, perhaps a strong or radical transformation, to then classify it as a revolution. And if you could compare that to the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, and the American Revolution. Thank you.
I can refer you to Crane Brenton's book, but anyway. But that's a good question because I did not define my term. And here the whole thing rests on that term. I would, when you think of it, I don't think a revolution has to be a violent overthrow. Let's put it that way, but it has to be an overthrow. In other words, where you can transform an institution or ways of doing things from in rather dramatic and in sometimes 180-degree different direction. And that's why I would argue, at least from the trustee minutes, it looks like a revolution, because when you move from the students not being considered at all in any decision, essentially, by the corporate body of the institution, to a point where the corporate body's decisions are overruled by the students, by the student behavior, and then to a point where what the corporate body has to discuss in great detail and at great length in its board meetings are what the students would like to see happen at the college. Still recognizing, not accepting that the students are the sovereign, that we the board are sovereign, but even though there were times when they couldn't be sovereign, but had the legal obligation of sovereignty. But in order to exercise our sovereignty, we have to take into account in a very serious way and a frequent way what the students want. So the student voice becomes a dominant theme. I won't say it's the only dominant theme, but one or two dominant themes in those board minutes for about 20 years or more, 25 years. That seems to me, in looking at them, to be a revolution. French Revolution, violent overthrow, but when they finally end up with Napoleon, so revolutions take very interesting twists and turns. So,
George, I think my one regret of the reunion is that I didn't attend the prison panel. I did attend Alumni College, where you started us off with a lecture, and if you looked at the George Drake schedule during reunion, it's incredible. I was considering retiring in a couple years, but seeing you as an inspiration, that is just not an acceptable possibility. And I was planning an event for reunion, and when we were looking at the schedule, the one thing we realized that we had to do was not conflict with this. It was better to conflict with people getting food. And I want to use a term that I've never used in my life before, but I hope I speak for the group in saying, you're a living treasure. Thank you.
Well, I'm glad Sue heard that. You're fortunate you don't have to live with me day in and day out. Okay, we're 1 minute before we have to close. So, one more question, I think, is somewhere.
Thanks, George. I'll try to make this quick, and maybe it's a question that you can answer quickly. What happened to the junior liberal arts exam? And do you look at that as part of the revolution?
Well, I fortunately know a little bit about that, because when I was here in 61, the faculty was creating the exam. So I remember going to faculty meetings and hearing those discussions. But what I'm told now, all the rest of this is anecdotal, because it lasted only about 2 years, isn't that right? It was an awkward thing to do. I mean, it was the right thing to do. I mean, Vaughn, here you are in the junior year, you're a liberal arts college. Now, what do you make of the liberal arts through an examination process? But with anything like, even, we don't have comprehensive exams anymore. If you're going to do something serious, you need some time to prepare for it. Where do you build in the time to prepare in an already packed set of weeks with courses and so on? How do you evaluate it? I mean, the times I've sat through evaluations of comprehensive exams, it's wild, because the attitudes of the faculty. I mean, I did this more at Colorado College than I've done here, but I can remember we would vary by 2. This person thinks it's a C and this person thinks it's an A, that kind of thing, and you begin to realize that you don't know what you're doing. You're bringing your own preconceptions of what a good history. I mean, it sort of helps to account for why you get this wild difference in exam grades from one class to the next and within the same department. People do have their predilections and so on. So I think that figured into it, too. It was a hard thing to evaluate, as well as a hard thing to do. But it's, as with so much of life, it was the right thing to do.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much.